Here we go. So Dr. Sam Arnold is currently finishing his postdoctoral fellowship here at the Center for Ethics and Society, and he will begin his assistant professorship at Texas Christian University in the coming fall. He received his master's degree in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh in 2004, and then received his Ph.D. in politics from Princeton University in 2011. His thesis, advised by the renowned political theorist Charles Bates, big deal.
I'll tell you said so. Yeah,
extends the central ideas of liberal egalitarianism to apply to justice in production, to issues like employment and distribution of meaningful jobs. Relatedly today, Dr. Arnold will be talking about the significance of economic freedom relative to other freedoms, like freedom of speech, association, and religion. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you guys today, so thanks very much for the invitation. Today I will be talking about, we're talking about what I call right-wing Rawlsianism. So there's, I'll explain Rawls and his theory and what comes, but just to preview a little bit. For a long time, John Rawls, a political philosopher from, who's now deceased, but from Harvard, stood as sort of the towering figure on the left in political philosophy. He provided sort of the most plausible articulation of left-wing principles of justice, many people thought. Recently, there's been this really exciting development in political philosophy where some political philosophers are now arguing that on their best interpretation, Rawlsian principles of justice actually point towards right-wing conservative institutions. So if you take Rawls's theory really seriously, you ought to vote for, say, Ron Paul, rather than Ralph Nader. So that's going to be the general topic of our discussion today. Is this plausible? Is it plausible that you can get from these left-wing Rawlsian principles of justice to right-wing institutions? Now, there's lots to talk about with respect to right-wing Rawlsianism, and I'm going to focus mainly on the issue of economic liberty. So, as we'll see, one of the central strands of the argument is that economic liberties, by Rawlsian lights, should count as really important basic liberties that deserve like the utmost level of protection against state interference. And that would have pretty radical implications for the way that government could interfere in the economy. Basically, it would prevent all government interference in the economy. So that would be a really radical change to the way that political philosophers normally think about Rawlsian philosophy and its implications for the state. So that's going to be the main focus then today, is this issue of economic liberty. How important is it if we take a generally Rawlsian standpoint? Should we count economic liberties as really basic liberties on a par with other basic liberties in our Bill of Rights, say, like freedom of speech? Or should we think that economic liberty is important but not that important? So we can infringe it in the name of other valuable social goals, like, say, social welfare or distributive justice. So that's the general gist. So here's another way to kind of approach the issue. Say that you endorse the goal of social justice. Should you protest against inequality with Occupy Wall Street? We are the 99%. Or should you march against overweening government interference with the Tea Party? And here's some Tea Partiers. And as I've just sort of sketched, answering this question is actually harder than you might think. If you identify social justice with Rawls's principles of justice, as I've suggested, there's this new movement that suggests, actually Rawls isn't with these guys. Rawls properly interpreted is with these guys. So, covering a bit of the terrain I've just already sketched, on the standard view, sort of the default view, that pretty much all political philosophers have operated under for the last 30 years or so, principles of social justice, like John Rawls's, require ample state intervention in the economy to redistribute wealth and income and opportunity. So if you care about equality and fairness, say, then you ought to prefer left-wing regimes to right-wing regimes. So you ought to prefer, say, like the Scandinavian model, Sweden, say, to a more conservative model, like the United States, or maybe something even further to the right of the United States, some sort of laissez-faire regime. And we should ask, though, whether this standard view is plausible. Is it really plausible that if you believe in social justice, you ought to prefer left-wing regimes. And right-wing Rawlsians, like this philosopher Ed Brown named John Tomasi, have recently argued that Rawlsian principles of justice require unabashedly and unapologetically capitalist pro-market institutions. So as I say, this is a really bold thesis. And I think if it were true, it really would completely transform political philosophy. But is this thesis plausible? So putting it more simply, if you buy this guy's argument, John Rawls, should you support, say, Barack Obama or Ron Paul? And I love this sign. Don't steal, the government hates competition. So that's the issue that we'll talk about today. So in order to make this issue comprehensible to you guys, I need to say a bit about Rawls's theory of social justice. So I'll give you a really quick primer on Rawls's theory of justice. So here's a way to understand what Rawls is all about. His theory is a theory of social justice. So it's meant to provide us with a standard for assessing when a society is just. So according to his view, a society is fully just if and only if its major social, political, and economic institutions conform to the following three principles of justice. First, a liberty principle that says, roughly, everyone is supposed to have equal basic liberties. And think of basic liberties as things like from our Bill of Rights. Civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, political liberties, the right to vote, the right to run for office, things like that. And maybe some economic liberties. We'll see, this is the issue. To what extent do economic liberties count as basic liberties? So economic liberties like freedom of occupation, the freedom to pursue whatever career you happen to want to pursue. Other economic liberties like liberties of owning, property rights. How much of your wealth should you be able to keep? Things like that. We'll talk in more detail about economic liberties and what follows. So that's the first principle. The second principle is actually composed of sort of two subparts. So the first part of the second principle is known as the fair equality of opportunity principle. It holds roughly that everyone should have equal opportunities, where this means roughly that social class should not determine your life prospects. So if you take an two people equally talented and motivated, one of whom grows up in Harlem and one of whom grows up in Greenwich, Connecticut, they should have equal life prospects, or else fair equality of opportunity is being violated. And finally, the difference principle, which governs social and economic inequalities, and it holds roughly that these inequalities are just only if they serve to maximize the well-being of the worst off. So inequalities in income, say, are permitted under Rawls's system, but only if they meet this really demanding standard, only if it can be shown that they're necessary to make the worst off as well off as possible. So maybe at a little, a less detailed level, you can think of one as expressing, the first principle is expressing an ideal of freedom. And you can think of 2 and 3 as together expressing an ideal of equality and fraternity. As Josh Cohen puts, the philosopher here at Stanford, as he likes to put the effect of 2 and 3. Basically, it says that the way we live together should leave no one worse off than anyone needs to be. That's the basic idea behind 2 and 3. Now, today we'll focus mostly on 1, although I'm also happy to talk about 2 and 3 and whether 2 and 3 point towards right-wing institutions. John Tomasi also argues that 2 and 3 point towards right-wing institutions, and I'm happy to talk about that after the presentation. But we'll focus in mainly on 1. So, to start, let's just think for a moment about what kind of society lives up to Rawls's principles. This is what I referred to earlier as the standard view, like the default assumption. Like if you believe Rawls, what kind of government should you prefer? Well, something like this. To secure freedom, we clearly need robust political and civil liberties. Now, on the default view, economic liberties aren't prioritized. So when Rawls thinks of basic liberties, he's thinking mainly of things like freedom of speech, political participation rights. He only counts 2 slender economic liberties as basic liberties. Freedom of occupation, which just means basically the state can't coercively force you to sweep streets or something. And a limited right to own personal but not productive property. So you have the right to own your clothes and maybe a living space. But you don't necessarily have a basic right, a constitutional right, to own the means of production or to control all of your wealth. You don't necessarily have that right. So it looks like a society that lives up to Rawls's liberty principle, anyway, will prioritize political and civil liberties, but maybe not economic liberties. Turning to the second and third principles, it looks like to secure equality, we're going to need a pretty interventionist state. This is the standard view. We're going to need a state that's not afraid to tax the rich, say, for purposes of redistribution, spreading the wealth. The state should definitely limit bequests, shouldn't allow, huge amounts of wealth and income being passed on from the rich to their children. And it's just, in general, a state living up to Rawlsian principles, many people think, will just regulate the economy in tons of ways. It's going to regulate labor markets, making sure that working conditions are humane and fair. It might impose minimum wage laws, maximum hours laws, things like that. And of course, it'll probably provide crucial social services like healthcare, universal healthcare, say, and quality education, maybe extending through college. So the bottom line, really, to this point is just that on the standard view of the implications of Rawls's theory, Rawlsians should prefer Sweden, say, to the United States. Sweden is more just by Rawlsian lights than the United States, according to the standard view. Now, John Tomasi, this philosopher at Brown, who's written this new book that I think is really exciting, this book called Free Market Fairness, thinks that the standard view that I just sketched is just totally wrong. Rawlsian principles, on his view, tilt, not just tilt, but like really tilt, far to the right, not to the left. So, he offers us two main arguments for this conclusion, that if you're a Rawlsian, you ought to think the United States is more just than Sweden. First argument concerns economic liberties, and it's the one we'll focus on during the presentation. His argument is pretty simple. He just thinks that economic liberties of working and owning count as basic liberties, alongside more familiar civil and political ones. And importantly, they count as basic liberties by the Rawlsian criteria for separating basic and non-basic liberties, by the Rawlsian criteria for figuring out which liberties are extremely important. And his second argument has to do with equality, basically. And it says that the poor do better under pro-market, unabashedly capitalist societies than they do under economically interventionist welfare states. So if you care about making the poor as well off as possible, as Rawlsians do, you ought to prefer capitalism to socialist or quasi-socialist regimes that have that sacrifice economic growth. So those are his two main arguments in a nutshell, and as I say, we'll focus on one. Okay, so here's the claim again. Economic liberties of working and owning count as basic liberties alongside more familiar civil and political liberties. So I touched on this a little bit already, but it's really worth underscoring how important the implications of this claim would be if they were true. This claim has really important ramifications. If it were true, it would indicate that we're required to install constitutional protections against government interference in economic affairs. So just as your freedom of speech, as in the Bill of Rights, you have freedom of speech guarantee. It means that the state can't restrict your speech except under very limited circumstances. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater or something. But beyond those very minimal circumstances, the state just has to let you say whatever you want, pretty much. Well, if economic liberty is like that, then you have to be allowed to do pretty much whatever you want with your wealth, and you have to be able to agree to pretty much any kind of contract that you wish. So the state can't impose, say, minimum wage laws. It can't tell you, you can only work for this guy if he pays you $5 an hour. That would be an intolerable restriction on a basic liberty, if Tomasi's right. So this claim really does have important ramifications. Another way to see this is that, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the US Supreme Court history, but there was this really important decision early in the 1900s called the Lochner decision. And in that decision, basically, the US Supreme Court overruled a New York state law that limited working hours for bakers. So the law said something like, you can't ask bakers to work for more than 10 or 12 hours a day or something. And the US Supreme Court said, that law is unconstitutional. It violates freedom of contract. And freedom of contract is implicit in, I think it was in the Due Process Clause of the US Constitution. So one way to understand what Tomasi is arguing for is that he's kind of arguing for a return to Lochner-style thinking. He's arguing that economic values or economic liberties like freedom of contract really are extremely important and weighty and override other worthy social goals like distributive justice. So it's going to be really important whether Tomasi is correct. And I think we need to look carefully at his argument. So the argument really is pretty simple. He just notes correctly that Rawlsians distinguish basic liberties from non-basic ones by means of a fairly simple test. They ask, do people, so they hold up, consider some candidate liberty L, like say freedom of speech. Do people need this liberty in order to do either of these two things? In order to A, develop and exercise the ethical and rational capacities they need to participate fully in social cooperation. And I'll say a little bit more about what that means. Or B, do they need this liberty to pursue a wide range of valued activities or life plans? And I'll say a little bit more about that as well. Now, if the answer to either of these questions is yes, then the liberty counts as a basic liberty. It must therefore be protected very strongly against government intervention. So, as I say, Tomasi claims that thick economic liberties of working and owning meet these standards. In fact, he thinks they meet both A and B. So let's consider more carefully those claims. It'll help to get a little clearer, I think, on what exactly these criteria are. So what does Rawls mean by ethical and rational capacities that people need to participate fully in social cooperation? Well, it's hard to talk about this without invoking a lot of thick jargon, but I'll do my best. So the core idea is that in order to participate, in order to be like a fully participating member of society, you need to have a minimally developed ethical sensibility. You need to be able to understand and apply principles of justice. So in asking whether, in evaluating political institutions, you need to be able to evaluate those institutions not just from the point of view of your own self-interest, but from some more encompassing moral point of view. And you need to be able to act on these moral evaluations. So you need to be sort of minimally ethically competent and minimally ethically motivated in order to participate fully in social cooperation. So that's one capacity that people need. Second capacity that people need to participate in social cooperation, Rawls thinks they need a bare capacity for a conception of the good. So this just means basically that people need to be able to decide for themselves what they want in life. And they need to be able to devise a rational plan for achieving that, whatever it is. So, if you're really interested in pursuing a particular career, or interested in family life, or art, or whatever, the idea is people who are full participants in social cooperation need to be able to chart their own way in life, and need to be able to figure out how to get to their goals, whatever they are. Now, the claim here is that whether people are able to develop these capacities depends crucially on the background liberties against which they live. So certain liberties, Rawls thinks, and Tomasi agrees, are going to be really crucial to developing these capacities. So if you live in a really illiberal society lacking, say, political liberties, it's plausible to think that you won't develop an adequate sense of justice. Like if you're never allowed to discuss politics, if you're never allowed to participate in politics, you may have a really stunted sense of justice. You just never think about justice. You're not really allowed to. So it is kind of plausible to think that certain liberties are really vital to the development of these sorts of capacities. So, as I say, an example of a liberty that's vital towards the development of a sense of justice is political liberty. And maybe for the second, all sorts of liberties seem really crucial towards developing and exercising your capacity for a conception of the good. Just imagine that our government's severely limited freedom of speech and association. So you couldn't talk freely, and you couldn't associate with whoever you wanted. That would really impact your ability to figure out what you wanted to do in life and to pursue your goals, whatever they were. So the general idea that certain liberties are crucial towards developing these capacities seems really plausible, I think. The question is whether economic liberties are amongst those liberties that are crucial. And as you'll see, I'm pretty skeptical. So, let's see. Right, let's consider economic liberties in this light. So we need to get a little bit clearer on what economic liberties are. I've said a couple times that they're liberties of working and owning. Here are some more specific examples. So under liberties of owning, you can think of things like liberties of deciding what to own, how much of it to own, what to do with what you own. Do you want to give all your wealth to this charity over here? Do you want to give it all to your son? Do you want to spend it all on consumption? The wider the range of choices available to you under these categories, the thicker the liberty of owning you have. So if the state limits how much you can own, you have a less robust liberty of owning than you would if the state said, hey, you can own as much as you can get your hands on. Liberties of working are maybe a little less familiar. So here too, just think of freedom of occupation, which job to pursue. Does the state tell you what kind of career you have to take? Also working conditions. Does the state impose any kind of requirements on the conditions under which people have to labor? Does it impose safety regulations? Does it impose hours limits? Does it require that you be paid a certain minimum wage? That kind of thing. So these are liberties of working and owning, and together they are the economic liberties. And the general idea is that the more scope a state grants for these liberties, the less it sort of interferes with these liberties, the thicker the conception of economic liberty. Okay. So now that we have a better handle on the test for what counts as a basic liberty, and we have a better handle on economic liberties, we can now see whether economic liberties pass the test. So here's the first part of the test. Do people need this liberty in order to develop and exercise the capacities that they need to be fully participating members of social cooperation? TOMASI'S claim is that, yeah, you do need very thick economic liberties of working and owning in order to develop these capacities. I must confess, I'm very puzzled by this argument, because it just seems like there's an obvious counterexample. So it just seems to me, if you think about a state like Sweden, again, where they do not have thick economic liberty by TOMASI'S lights. The Swedish state interferes in economic life in all sorts of ways. Surely it's implausible to say then that Swedes are unable to adequately develop and exercise the ethical and rational capacities they need to participate fully in social cooperation. I mean, Swedes seem to have perfectly functioning senses of justice, maybe better functioning senses of justice than we do, and they also seem able to, devise a conception of the good and follow it. So I really think TOMASI is on shaky ground with this part of the test. I don't find his view very plausible at all on this part of the test. I think his view is a little more strong when we turn to B, the second part of the test. So we'll turn to that now. So here's the second part of the test. That should be B up there instead of A. So the second part of the test says that a liberty is basic if it is necessary to pursue a wide range of valued activities or life plans. TOMASI thinks that economic liberties do indeed pass this test, like thick economic liberties. Like you really need, unfettered freedom of contract. You need the state to stay out of your working life, etc., in order to pursue a wide range of valued activities. Now, again, the question is how plausible this is. So, in favor of TOMASI'S view, it does seem plausible to think that people have an interest in determining where they work, for sure, and even the conditions under which they work. There are people who don't mind working 14 hours a day. There are people who don't mind, who would prefer to work for less than the minimum wage, because maybe that option is better than no job at all. So it does seem plausible to think that people have an interest in wider economic freedom, at least under certain circumstances. But the conclusion is meant to be that if a state denies people the freedom to decide these issues for themselves, then it thereby prevents them from pursuing a sufficiently wide range of valued activities. And then, of course, the ultimate conclusion is that people do need thick economic liberty in order to pursue a wide range of valued activities or life plans. That's TOMASI'S argument. But, again, I don't find this in the end convincing. I think Tomasi just overstates the importance of economic liberty. And, you know, not just Tomasi, but I think this is also a kind of indictment of sort of really right-wing politics in the United States, maybe, the Tea Party, etc. I think that we don't need to deny that certain aspects of economic liberty are extremely important. And without them, we really would feel ourselves deeply unfree. So I think these two economic liberties in particular seem very important to freedom. Freedom of occupation and the right to own at least personal property. So if the state really did tell you what kind of job you had to take, that would be you'd be living in a deeply unfree society. You would not really be able to chart your own way in life. The state would be charting your way for you. And so too, if the state denied you property rights over personal property, you know, if you didn't own your toothbrush or your clothes, and you know, everybody had government-issued toothbrushes and clothes, that would, I think, really stunt the development of personality, and it would stunt the development of people's capacities to chart their own way in life. So I agree, these economic liberties count as basic liberties. No state should violate these. These deserve constitutional protection. But these are the only economic liberties, I think, that deserve that heightened degree of protection. I just don't think it's plausible to say that people really need to be free to, say, work for less than the minimum wage, or to be able to transfer 100% of their wealth to their kids, etc., in order to lead a meaningful and worthwhile life, or in order to be able to develop, you know, the capacities they need to engage in social cooperation. So that really is the main thrust of my reply to Tomasi. And let me sum up before maybe suggesting a few questions that we might talk about. So, summing up what we've done here today, I started off by sketching the standard view, which is that social justice requires left-wing regimes that are highly economically interventionist. Tomasi, and not just Tomasi, actually there are a few other philosophers making this kind of argument, so it really is kind of a movement. These philosophers deny the standard view. They hold that social justice requires pro-market, laissez-faire capitalism. This is a really interesting move philosophically because it's like taking Rawlsian premises and trying to arrive at a libertarian conclusion. So if they pulled it off, it would be really amazing. But as we've seen, I don't think that they actually pull it off. And I focused on this argument in particular, this idea that economic liberty, according to Tomasi, counts as a basic liberty that's just as important as political or civil liberties. And Tomasi notes properly, I think, that only laissez-faire regimes would honor this fact, if indeed it were a fact, that, you know, economic liberties were basic liberties. We haven't really talked about the second aspect of the argument here, so I'll just skip over it. I focused on Tomasi's claims about economic liberty, and I've suggested that they're just not very plausible. Really, the bottom line is that economic liberties are important, and therefore they should be limited only for good reasons. There should be a default presumption in favor of granting each citizen, you know, wide latitude to determine for herself her economic conditions and the details of her economic life. But, bottom line, economic liberties are not nearly as important, I think, as civil or political liberties. And so states may, with perfect justice, restrict these economic liberties in the name of social welfare or other social values. So, one way to sort of graphically depict the bottom line here, Rawlsians, I think, can in good conscience prefer column A, Scandinavia-style social democracy, to, say, the United States' more pro-market model. So that's really it. I do have some questions that we could think about. Why don't I just throw them up? And I'm also happy to talk about whatever. But I'm really curious to hear your reaction about economic liberty and whether you think that economic liberty is really important to your life. Because maybe I'm just being uncharitable to Tomasi, and maybe economic liberty is much more important than I realize. So I'm interested in hearing whether you think that there are particular economic liberties that are important to you, and also whether these liberties seem as important to you as civil or political liberties. Like, compare, for instance, the right to open a barber shop without, you know, getting a license, say, with the right to vote. Tomasi seems to think that these are like equally valuable, and that doesn't seem plausible to me, but I'm open to being convinced otherwise. Second, I mean, the Rawlsian way of identifying basic liberties is a little arcane. I mean, it goes through this, you know, you have to talk about all these capacities that are necessary for social cooperation, etc. And the thought is that, like, certain liberties are super important precisely because you need them to develop those capacities. I'm curious if you find that like a plausible explanation of the importance of basic liberty. maybe you have some more intuitive and sort of straightforward way of explaining why civil and political liberties are so important. So if so, I'd certainly welcome your thoughts. And finally, I didn't have time to discuss Tomasi's second argument about distributive justice, but I'm happy to talk about that if you want. The basic idea there, again, is just that capitalism is better for the poor because it promotes growth. So we should prefer capitalist economies if we're RAWLS'Ians. So that's really it. Thanks.